I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a cabin, deep in the woods, far from people, far from noise, far from everything. I had rented the place from a guy online who described it as secluded, peaceful, and perfect for getting away from it all. That was exactly what I needed. No phone service, no internet, just nature. The drive there was rough. The last 20 miles were all dirt roads, winding through thick trees. It had rained the night before, and the ground was slick with mud. More than once, my tires slid, and I had to grip the wheel tight to keep control. The deeper I drove, the more isolated it felt. No houses, no cars, not even signs. Just trees and silence. When I finally arrived, I was relieved to see the cabin standing just as it had been in the listing photos. A simple wooden structure, tucked between trees, with a small porch and a stack of firewood against the side. It wasn't big, just one room with a bed, a wood stove, and a small kitchen area. A separate door led to a tiny bathroom. There was no electricity, just a few lanterns. It was exactly what I had wanted. I unloaded my bags, bringing everything inside. I had brought enough food for the week, knowing there wouldn't be any stores nearby. After setting my things down, I stepped outside and took a deep breath. The air was crisp and smelled like pine. The only sounds were birds and the wind through the trees. No cars, no distant hum of civilization, just silence. I spent the first few hours settling in. I collected some firewood, made a small meal, and sat on the porch as the sun started to set. The darkness came fast. Without city lights, it was almost immediate. I lit a lantern and took one last look outside before heading in. The trees were nothing but black shapes now, blending together, forming a wall of darkness around the cabin. Inside, I locked the door, feeling a little foolish for doing so. There was no one out here. I told myself it was just habit. The wind picked up outside, making the trees creak. I climbed into bed, listening to the quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, pressing down on you. I wasn't used to it, but eventually I drifted off. Somewhere in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was dark, the fire had died down, and everything was silent. Then I heard it, a sound from outside, a soft crunching, like footsteps in the leaves. My heart pounded. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. I stayed still, listening. More footsteps, slow, deliberate, too heavy for an animal. I sat up, holding my breath. The steps moved closer, stopping just outside the cabin. I stared at the door, waiting. The silence stretched on. Then, after what felt like forever, the steps moved away, fading into the trees. I stayed awake for hours, listening, but the sounds never came back. By morning, I told myself it had just been my imagination. Maybe the wind had knocked something over. Maybe I had still been half asleep. I pushed the thought aside and went about my day. I took a walk through the woods, following a narrow trail behind the cabin. The trees were thick, their branches forming a tunnel overhead. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The silence was too complete. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just my own footsteps. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. When I got back to the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. I made a fire, ate a small meal, and tried to relax. As the sun set, the uneasy feeling returned. I told myself it was just nerves, the isolation playing tricks on me. That night, the footsteps came again, closer this time, slow, circling the cabin. I sat up in bed, frozen. I thought about calling out, but what would I say? Who would I be talking to? I reached for the lantern, but I stopped myself. If someone was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, waiting, then a soft tap, just once, then silence. I sat there, heart pounding, waiting for something else. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a light, restless sleep. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I had planned to stay the whole week, but something wasn't right. I stepped outside and froze. The ground around the cabin was covered in footprints. Not animal tracks, shoe prints. Someone had been outside my cabin all night. I grabbed my things and threw them into my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The drive back was a blur. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. But there was nothing, just trees. When I reached town, I stopped at a gas station to collect myself. I told the clerk I had been staying in a cabin up in the woods. He raised an eyebrow. "Nobody's rented that place in years," he said. I didn't respond. I just got back in my car and kept driving. I never looked back. The road twisted through the trees, narrowing as I got deeper into the forest. The sun was starting to set, and the last light filtered through the branches, casting long shadows across the dirt road. I hadn't seen another car in miles, which made sense, considering how far off the main highway I had come. The GPS on my phone had lost signal over an hour ago, but I had memorized the turns before setting out. I wasn't worried about getting lost, but there was something unsettling about being this isolated. I was heading to an old cabin that I had rented for a week. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small place by a lake, deep in the woods. The listing had mentioned that it was a bit rundown, but that was fine by me. I wasn't looking for luxury. I needed quiet, a break from everything. No emails, no calls, no city noise. Just the woods, the lake, and time to clear my head. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the trees, and the sky was a deep blue. The cabin looked smaller than it had in the pictures. It was a simple wooden structure, with a porch that sagged slightly and a roof that looked like it had seen better days. The front door was closed, but one of the shutters on the window hung loose, knocking softly against the side of the cabin in the light breeze. I stepped out of my car and stretched. The air smelled damp, a mix of pine and earth, with something else underneath, something faintly sour. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and walked up the porch steps. The wood creaked under my weight. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The inside was dark and smelled of dust and old wood. I felt along the wall for a light switch, but when I flipped it, nothing happened. I sighed and pulled out my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small room with a wooden table, a chair, and a narrow bed pushed up against the far wall. There was a fireplace in one corner, but the hearth was filled with cold ash. The kitchen area was little more than a counter with a few cabinets above it. There was an old gas stove, but I wasn't sure if it worked. I set my bag down and walked over to the window. The glass was grimy, but I could see the lake through it. It was dark now, the surface completely still. I turned back to the room and noticed something strange. The dust on the floor was thick, except for a set of faint footprints leading from the door to the window. They weren't mine. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I had just gotten here. No one else should have been inside. I shook off the feeling and told myself it was probably just from the last person who stayed here. Maybe they had cleaned up before leaving, except for that one spot. I checked the small bathroom. It was basic, just a toilet, a sink, and a tiny shower with a curtain that had yellowed over time. The mirror above the sink was cracked in one corner. I turned the faucet. The pipes groaned before water sputtered out, rusty at first, then clearing. After making sure everything was in working order, I went back to the main room and started a fire in the fireplace. It took a while, but soon enough, the flames crackled, casting flickering light around the cabin. The warmth helped push away the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. I ate a quick meal, then sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the fire. Outside, the forest was silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no night sounds. I lay down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was just outside, watching. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just the isolation, the unfamiliar place. Eventually, exhaustion won over and I drifted off. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Something had woken me, but I didn't know what. Then I heard it, a soft creaking, like footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The creaking stopped. I waited, straining my ears, but there was nothing, just silence. I told myself it was probably just the wood shifting from the temperature change. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found something strange outside. Footprints in the dirt near the porch. They weren't mine. They led from the trees, stopped at the porch steps, then turned back. I checked the cabin door. It was still locked. I tried to tell myself that maybe it had been an animal, but the prints were clearly human. The day passed uneventfully. I stayed close to the cabin, gathering wood for the fireplace and checking out the lake. The water was calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I would turn quickly, expecting to see something behind me, but there was never anything there. That night, I barely slept. The wind had picked up, causing the trees to creak and groan. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to a sound just outside the window, a faint tapping. I held my breath and turned my head slowly. The window was dark, but I thought I saw a shadow move outside. My heart slammed against my ribs. I reached for the flashlight, but my hand was shaking. I clicked it on and pointed it at the window. Nothing. The tapping had stopped. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, staring at the window, waiting. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things, threw them into the car, and got ready to leave. But before I did, I walked around the cabin one last time. Near the back of the cabin, where I hadn't gone before, I found something that made my blood run cold. More footprints. They led from the forest to the window, the same window where I had heard the tapping. But what scared me most was that they weren't just leading to the window. There were marks in the dirt beneath it, as if someone had been standing there for a long time, watching. I didn't waste any more time. I got in my car and drove. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was already disappearing behind the trees. I gripped the wheel tighter and focused on the road ahead. I never looked back. I had been looking forward to some time alone, away from the constant noise and rush of daily life. The idea of staying in a cabin deep in the woods seemed perfect. A friend of mine owned it, a small wooden structure nestled miles away from any sign of civilization. He had offered it to me for a week, telling me it was the perfect place to clear my mind and enjoy some quiet. I packed enough supplies to last, loaded my truck, and made the drive out there. The road leading to the cabin was rough, barely more than a dirt path, with thick trees pressing in from both sides. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the sound of my tires crunching over loose gravel was the only noise for miles. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing where it stood. The place was small, built from thick logs with a sloping roof. A porch wrapped around the front, and a single window looked out over the forest. There was no electricity, just an old gas lantern and a wood-burning stove. It was exactly what I had wanted. After unloading my supplies, I locked my truck and went inside. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of aged wood and dust. I set my bags down and checked the place over. There was a narrow bed pushed against the far wall, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with old canned goods. A fireplace sat in the corner, cold and filled with ash. Everything was simple, worn from years of use but sturdy. I spent the first evening settling in, chopping some wood for the stove and cooking a simple meal. The silence outside was almost unnerving. No cars, no distant voices, nothing but the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of crickets. As darkness fell, the forest became an endless black void beyond the windows. I sat by the fire for a long time, staring into the flames, until finally, I turned in for the night. The first strange thing happened sometime in the early hours of the morning. I woke up to a sound just outside the cabin. It was faint, but distinct, the sound of footsteps moving slowly through the dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped, then started again, circling the cabin. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A deer? Maybe, but the steps were too deliberate, too slow. I lay still for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the noise to stop. Eventually, it did. I listened for a while longer before exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the memory of the sounds felt almost distant, like a half-remembered dream. Still, when I stepped outside, I checked the ground. The leaves were disturbed in places, as if something had moved through them, but there were no clear tracks. Shaking it off, I went about my day. The second night, I woke up again, this time to something more unsettling. The sound of footsteps returned, but they were closer, almost right up against the walls of the cabin. A slow, dragging noise accompanied them, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. My pulse pounded in my ears as I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling. Then, a soft, deliberate scraping against the wood of the cabin wall. I sat up, gripping the blanket tightly. The noise moved along the length of the cabin, stopping near the door. I waited, barely breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded into the woods. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I found fresh disturbances in the dirt around the cabin. Drag marks, faint but visible, leading toward the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. Something about them unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I spent the day keeping myself busy, trying to shake the unease that clung to me. That evening, I made sure everything was locked. I placed a heavy wooden chair against the door and kept my hunting knife close. Hours passed in silence, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I clenched the knife tighter. Then, something heavier, a dull thud against the wooden wall. Another, a steady, rhythmic knocking. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. The knocking continued, slow and patient. Then suddenly silence. Minutes passed. Then something new. A faint sound, almost like breathing, just outside the window. My skin crawled. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. I didn't move. I sat there, knife in hand, staring at the window, but I couldn't see beyond the darkness outside. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The woods fell silent again. I barely slept the rest of the night. When dawn came, I stepped outside, scanning the clearing. The ground near the cabin was disturbed again, but this time, something else caught my eye. Near the edge of the trees, half buried in the dirt, was something unnatural. A piece of fabric, torn and dirty, caught on a low branch. I walked toward it slowly, my gut tightening. When I reached it, I hesitated before picking it up. It was old, weathered, but unmistakably a piece of clothing. A shirt, and it wasn't mine. I turned and looked back toward the cabin, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable. Someone had been out here. Someone had been watching. I packed my things within the hour, shoving everything into my truck as fast as I could. The feeling of being watched never left me. Even as I drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see something standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. I never told my friend what happened. I just told him I wouldn't be using the cabin again. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods, and whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They had been waiting. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a remote cabin, away from the noise of the city, away from people, away from everything. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I needed the break, needed the isolation. Work had been piling up, and I could feel myself burning out. My plan was simple: hike, read, relax, and reset. The drive out there was long, mostly winding roads through dense forest. The kind of roads where you don't see another car for miles. I had rented the cabin online, one of those old wooden places with a stone fireplace and big windows looking out over the trees. The owner had sent me directions and a warning that there was no cell service. That was fine with me. I wanted to disconnect. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting. The cabin was smaller than I expected but looked sturdy. It sat at the end of a narrow dirt path, with trees packed tightly around it. There was a small clearing in front where I parked. I got out, stretched, and breathed in the cold, crisp air. It smelled like pine and damp earth. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. It was perfect. I unloaded my supplies: food, water, firewood, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries. I had everything I needed. The inside of the cabin was simple but cozy. A main room with a couch and a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom in the back. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just silence. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some canned food, and read until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. The bed was old but comfortable enough. I slept deeply. The next morning, I decided to explore. I took my backpack, filled a bottle with water, and set off into the woods. The trails weren't marked, but I wasn't too worried. I had a good sense of direction and my compass. The forest was beautiful. Tall trees, thick undergrowth, the occasional sound of birds or a snapping branch. I walked for hours, stopping now and then to rest. Around midday, I found a small stream. The water was clear, flowing gently over smooth rocks. I crouched down, splashed some on my face, and sat on a fallen log to eat a granola bar. It was peaceful. Then I saw it. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth, leading away from the stream. I looked around, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The prints were large, maybe a man's, and they didn't belong to me. I hadn't seen another person since I got here. I followed them for a few steps before stopping myself. It was probably just a hiker, I told myself, but something about them bothered me. They weren't coming from anywhere. They just started near the stream and led off into the trees. I decided to head back to the cabin. The hike back felt different, like the trees were closer, the shadows darker. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me. A twig snapping, leaves rustling. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Back at the cabin, I locked the door, something I hadn't done the night before. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I checked the windows, making sure they were shut tight. That night, the noises started. Soft at first, branches creaking, leaves moving in the wind. But then I heard something else. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I listened, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped near the cabin, right outside. I waited, staring at the dark ceiling. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it and forced myself to sleep. In the morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp from the night's cold air. There were footprints, leading around the cabin, stopping by the windows. I didn't go hiking that day. Instead, I stayed close to the cabin, keeping an eye on the tree line. I felt watched. The whole day I felt watched. The sun started to set, and I locked myself inside early. The fire burned low as I sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight, waiting. The footsteps came again that night, closer. This time I heard breathing, a slow, heavy sound outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then the doorknob rattled. Once, twice. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so tight my fingers ached. The door was locked. I knew it was locked, but I had never felt so vulnerable in my life. The rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away, but I didn't sleep. At first light, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up, loaded everything into the car, and didn't bother cleaning up. I just wanted to go. The engine roared to life and I pulled out fast, tires kicking up dirt. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A man stood in the tree line, just at the edge of the clearing. Tall, wearing dark clothes, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I was miles away, until I saw other cars, other people. Only then did I pull over, hands shaking, breath coming in gasps. I never went back, never contacted the owner, never told anyone what happened. I don't know who he was, what he wanted, or how long he had been watching me. But I know this, I was not alone in those woods, and I never will be again. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A remote cabin deep in the woods, away from the noise of the city, away from people, just me and the quiet of nature. I packed everything I thought I would need: food, water, extra clothes, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a hunting knife just in case. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, and he had told me it was in decent condition but warned me that it was deep in the woods, completely off-grid. No phone signal, no electricity, nothing but the cabin and the wilderness. The drive was long, taking me through winding mountain roads, the trees getting denser the further I went. The last stretch of the journey was a dirt path barely wide enough for my car. It was rough, full of potholes and tree roots that made the ride bumpy. After what felt like forever, I finally saw the cabin. It was small, made of old wood that had turned gray from years of exposure. There was a porch with a single rocking chair and a small window to the side, partially covered with an old curtain. The forest around it was thick, pressing in from all sides. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows between the trees. I got out of the car and stretched, taking a deep breath. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was eerily quiet. No sound of cars, no distant hum of power lines, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. I grabbed my bag and walked up the porch, testing the wooden planks beneath my feet. They creaked but held firm. The door was unlocked, just as I had been told it would be. I pushed it open, and a musty smell greeted me. The inside was simple: a single room with a wooden bed, a small table, and an old cast-iron stove. There was a fireplace on one wall, filled with ash and bits of burnt wood. Dust floated in the air, catching the light from the open door. I dropped my bag on the bed and checked the place out. The windows were small and dirty, but intact. The walls had scratches, probably from past visitors moving furniture around. There were no signs of mice or insects, which was a relief. I set up a few things, placed my flashlight and knife on the table, put my food in a small cupboard, and laid out my sleeping bag on the bed. As the sun dipped below the trees, the cabin grew darker. I lit a few candles I had brought with me and settled into the chair by the fireplace. The silence was both calming and unnerving. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. No distant city sounds, no hum of electronics, just the occasional crack of wood shifting or the wind whispering through the trees. At some point, I dozed off. I wasn't sure how long I had been asleep, but I woke up with a start. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Something had woken me, but I didn't know what. I listened, holding my breath. The wind had picked up, making the trees outside groan and sway. Then, I heard it. A faint rustling, different from the wind. It was close, too close. I sat up slowly, my heart beginning to pound. The sound came again, a soft crunching of leaves just outside the cabin. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The candles flickered as the wind slipped through the cracks in the walls. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. Then, a thud. Something against the side of the cabin. Not loud, but enough to make my breath catch. I turned toward the window, but it was too dark to see anything outside. I cursed myself for not bringing a lantern. The flashlight was on the table, but turning it on might give away my position. I decided to wait, gripping the knife tighter. Minutes passed, stretching endlessly. The noises stopped. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing. I forced myself to relax, telling myself it was probably just an animal. A raccoon, maybe. A deer brushing against the cabin. I lay back down, still holding the knife, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside, my muscles stiff from sleeping in fear. The ground was covered in a thin layer of fallen leaves and twigs. I walked around the cabin, searching for any signs of what might have been outside. That's when I saw them, footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows, at the door. My stomach clenched. Someone had been out here watching me. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The footprints were fresh. Whoever it was had been here last night, standing outside while I slept. I went back inside and locked the door, as if that would do any good. My mind raced. Should I leave? But my car was parked a short distance away, and I had to hike to it. If someone was out there, they could be waiting. I grabbed my knife again and forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a lost hiker. Maybe someone just curious about the cabin. I spent the day on edge, checking the windows every few minutes, listening for any sound. When night came, I built a fire in the fireplace and stayed awake as long as I could. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The rustling, the soft crunch of leaves. This time it was slower, deliberate. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The noise stopped right outside the door. Then the doorknob turned. It was slow, testing. My blood ran cold. I gripped my knife, ready. The knob turned again, harder this time, but the lock held. A long silence followed. Then, footsteps, slow, circling the cabin, pausing at each window. I didn't move. I sat there, staring at the door, my breath shallow. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The footsteps faded into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I grabbed my things, threw them into my bag, and left. I didn't run. I forced myself to walk, listening for any sound. When I reached my car, I checked the trees one last time before getting in and locking the doors. I started the engine and drove away without looking back. I never found out who it was. I never told anyone what happened. But I know one thing for sure, whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't just passing by. They knew I was there, and they were waiting. I had rented the cabin for a week. It was far from everything, deep in the forest, accessible only by an old dirt road that wound through the trees for miles. It was the kind of place I had been looking for. No neighbors, no distractions, just quiet and isolation. I had been feeling drained, tired of the noise and the constant pressure of everyday life, and I needed this break. Just a few days of hiking, reading, and being alone in nature. The cabin itself was small but solid. It had a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a wood stove in the main room. The walls were old wood, worn and darkened with age. There was no electricity, just an oil lamp on the table and a flashlight I had brought with me. The water came from a well outside, and there was an outhouse a short walk behind the cabin. It was simple, but I liked it that way. I wasn't looking for luxury. The first day was quiet. I unpacked my food, set up my sleeping bag on the old bed, and took a short walk around the area. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, thick with trees and undergrowth. I found a small stream nearby, its water running clear and cold over smooth rocks. The air smelled clean, the kind of freshness you only find deep in the woods, far from cars and buildings. Felt good, peaceful. That night, I built a small fire in the wood stove, made a simple meal, and sat outside for a while before going to bed. The stars were bright, clearer than I had ever seen them. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant call of an owl. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned low, filling the cabin with a faint orange glow. I listened, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. The woods outside were silent, too silent. I hadn't noticed it before, but the usual sounds of the night, crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, were gone. Then I heard it, a single sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I stayed still, barely breathing. My heart was pounding. The sound had come from outside, close to the cabin. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe moving through the undergrowth, but something about it didn't feel right. I waited, listening, but the sound didn't come again. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for any signs of what had made the noise. The ground was covered in leaves, undisturbed except for a few deer tracks near the trees. I told myself I had imagined it, that I had been half asleep and overreacting. The day passed quietly. I hiked a few miles into the woods, following a narrow trail that led up a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was incredible. Rolling hills covered in dense green, untouched and wild. It made me feel small in the best way. That night, I locked the door, made sure the fire was well fed, and tried to sleep. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night, and again, the forest was completely silent. I lay still, waiting, and then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I gripped my flashlight and sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The steps were soft, but they were there, moving, stopping, moving again. Someone was outside. I didn't move. I just listened, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped near the front door. A long silence. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly stopped breathing. I had locked it. I knew I had, but the sound of metal against metal sent a cold wave of fear through me. Someone was testing it, trying to see if it would open. I held the flashlight tightly, ready to turn it on, but I didn't. Instead, I waited. After a few seconds, the rattling stopped. Then the footsteps moved again, slow, shuffling, fading into the trees. I sat there for a long time before I finally got up. I moved to the window carefully, slowly, and looked out. Nothing, just darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked the area again. This time, I found something. Footprints in the dirt near the door. Bare footprints. The toes dug slightly into the soft earth, uneven, like whoever had made them had been walking unsteadily. My stomach turned as I followed them a few feet into the trees. They disappeared into the undergrowth. I thought about leaving. I should have, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was some lost hiker, confused, looking for shelter. Maybe they didn't mean any harm. That night, I sat up with the oil lamp burning low. I didn't bother getting into bed. I just waited, and just past midnight, the footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They moved around the cabin, slow and patient, circling. I could hear the leaves crunching underfoot. The sound moved past the front window, then to the back, then to the side. I held my breath, gripping the knife I had taken from my pack. Then silence. I didn't move. I stayed like that for hours, listening. The fire crackled. The oil lamp flickered, but outside, nothing. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't care about finishing my trip. I didn't care about leaving food behind. I just needed to go. When I stepped outside, my breath caught in my throat. More footprints, dozens of them, all around the cabin, circling, overlapping. Some were fresh, pressed into the damp earth. Others were older, faded, but still there. I got in my truck and started the engine. The dirt road felt longer than before, twisting through the trees. Every shadow felt like something watching. When I reached the main road, I drove straight to the nearest town. I stopped at a small diner, still shaking. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Just nerves, just paranoia. Then the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, asked where I had come from. I told her about the cabin, about the footsteps, about the footprints. She went quiet for a moment, then just shook her head. "You're lucky," she said. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I had been searching for a quiet place to stay for a few days, away from the city noise and the constant pressure of work. A friend had told me about a small cabin deep in the woods, far from any roads or towns. It was owned by a retired ranger who rented it out to people looking for solitude. I had no reason to suspect anything unusual about it. It was just supposed to be a peaceful getaway. The drive to the nearest drop-off point took me about 4 hours, and from there, I had to hike through the forest for another 2. The trail was well-worn but empty, just the way I liked it. The trees were thick and tall, blocking out most of the sky. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional chirp of birds hidden in the branches. When I finally reached the cabin, I was exhausted. It was a small structure made of dark, weathered wood, sitting in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. There was a narrow porch with an old wooden chair, a single window at the front, and a door with a rusted handle. It looked like it had been standing there for decades, untouched by time. I pushed the door open, and the hinges let out a long creak. Inside, the air was stale, as if no one had been there for months. A small wood-burning stove sat in one corner, next to a stack of firewood. There was a single bed against the far wall, covered in a thin, dusty blanket. A wooden table stood near the window, with a single chair pushed up against it. Everything was simple, functional, and eerily quiet. I set my backpack down and took a moment to settle in. I checked the cabinets for supplies and found a few canned goods left behind, though I had brought my own food. There was a jug of water on the counter, but I planned to collect fresh water from a nearby stream I had passed on my way up. After making sure the cabin was in order, I stepped outside to gather some firewood before nightfall. The air had grown colder, and the forest around me seemed darker than before. As I bent down to pick up a few fallen branches, I had the strange feeling that I was being watched. I turned quickly, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows stretching between the trunks. I shook the feeling off and went back inside. The first night was uneventful. I built a small fire in the stove, warmed up some food, and sat at the table with my flashlight, reading a book I had brought. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, making a soft rustling sound. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. But the second night, things changed. It started with a sound, a faint rustling, barely noticeable over the wind. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. It wasn't the wind moving through the trees. It was something closer, something moving just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. Then, after a long pause, there was a soft crunch, like a footstep pressing down on dried leaves. I sat up slowly, careful not to make any noise. My heart was beating hard in my chest. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it at the window, but the glass was too dirty to see anything outside. I didn't move for a long time, just sat there in the silence, listening. But whatever it was, it didn't make another sound. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal and lay back down. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around the cabin. The ground was damp from the night's dew, and scattered leaves covered most of the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then, a few feet from the cabin, I noticed something. Footprints. Human footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth. And they weren't mine. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around quickly, but the forest was still and empty. I followed the prints with my eyes, tracing them back towards the tree line. They stopped just at the edge of the woods, as if someone had been standing there watching the cabin. I told myself it had to be another hiker, maybe someone passing through, but that didn't make sense. The cabin was far off any main trail, and I hadn't seen another person since I started my hike. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I almost convinced myself to leave early, but I had planned to stay for 3 more nights, and I didn't want to let paranoia ruin my trip. That night, I locked the door and placed a chair under the handle for good measure. I kept my flashlight and a knife beside me as I lay in bed, listening. Hours passed. The fire in the stove burned down to embers. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again. A footstep, then another, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. A long pause, then the doorknob turned. My heart pounded. I gripped the knife tightly, waiting, every muscle in my body frozen. The doorknob rattled, harder this time. The chair against the door shifted slightly. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I didn't move. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and at some point, I must have fallen asleep. By morning, the footprints were there again. More of them this time circling the cabin. Some led back into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I didn't stay to find out who it was. I packed my things as fast as I could and left, hiking back down the trail without stopping. My hands were shaking the entire way. I didn't feel safe until I reached my car and locked the doors behind me. I never reported it. What would I have said? That someone had been watching me? That someone had tried to get inside? There was no proof, no damage, nothing stolen. Just footprints in the dirt. But I know what I heard. And I know that if I had stayed one more night, whoever was out there wouldn't have just stopped at the door. I had been planning this trip for months, ever since I found the listing online. A remote cabin deep in the woods, miles away from any town or city, promising complete solitude and a break from the constant noise of daily life. The pictures showed a well-built structure, sturdy wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch. It seemed perfect. The drive out took longer than I expected. The last stretch of road wasn't even a road at all, just a dirt path winding through dense trees. My car's tires kicked up loose gravel, and at one point, I thought I'd get stuck. I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun already dipping below the horizon. The trees around the cabin were thick, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. I grabbed my bags, locked my car, and made my way to the door. The key was in a lockbox on the porch, just as the owner had said. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust. I flicked on the lights. A single bulb in the center of the ceiling hummed to life, casting dim light over the small space. There was a living area with a worn-out couch, a small kitchen with an old gas stove, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed pushed against the wall. I set my bags down and went to check out the back. The forest was close, almost too close. The trees stood like silent walls, enclosing the cabin. The only open space was the narrow clearing where my car sat. That first night, I lay in bed listening to the absolute silence outside. No traffic, no people, no distant hum of civilization. Just the occasional creak of wood as the cabin settled and the faint rustling of wind in the trees. I slept deeply, waking only once when something outside made a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. I told myself it was an animal and went back to sleep. The next morning, I went for a walk. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest, moving carefully over roots and loose rocks. The deeper I went, the more I felt an odd sense of unease. The trees were thick here, their branches tangled high above, blocking out most of the sky. The air was still. I turned back, deciding not to go any further. That night, I heard the sound again. A crack outside, then another. Something was moving. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound was close, right outside the cabin. I held my breath, my ears straining. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But then I heard something that made my stomach drop. A faint, deliberate scraping sound against the cabin wall. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, waiting for whatever was outside to leave. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. The next morning, I went outside to check. There were no tracks, no signs that anything had been there. I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The third night was worse. I woke up to a noise directly on the porch. The sound of something shifting, moving. Then the doorknob rattled. My heart pounded in my chest. I sat frozen in bed, waiting. The rattling stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I got up slowly, moving as quietly as I could. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. I shone the light outside, sweeping it across the porch. Nothing. But then I saw it. A single boot print in the dirt just beyond the steps. Too big to be an animal, too clear to be old. Someone had been there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my bags. I had planned to stay a full week, but I couldn't do it anymore. Something wasn't right. I loaded my things into the car, locking the cabin behind me. As I pulled onto the dirt path, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. Standing just at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just kept driving until I reached the main road. I never found out who or what had been outside my cabin those nights, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The sky was washed in deep shades of orange and purple, the last bit of daylight slipping behind the treetops. The road leading up to the cabin was narrow, barely more than a dirt path, winding through thick forest. My truck's tires kicked up small rocks as I pulled into the clearing where the cabin stood, isolated, surrounded on all sides by tall trees that seemed to press in. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet. No birds, no wind rustling through the leaves, just complete, unnatural silence. I stepped out and stretched my legs. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. The cabin was small, old, made of weathered wood, with a sagging porch and a roof that looked like it had seen better days. I grabbed my bag from the truck and walked up the creaking steps, the wood groaning under my weight. The key was under a loose plank, just as the owner had told me. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the hinges protesting loudly. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a small kitchenette in one corner, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a couch pushed against the far wall. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of dust and old wood. I dropped my bag by the couch and started checking the place out. The windows were grimy, the glass warped with age. The furniture was worn, the cushions on the couch sunken. There was an old wood stove near the back wall, a stack of firewood beside it. After unpacking, I went outside to gather more firewood. The sun had disappeared behind the trees, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. The forest felt different in the dark. The trees, tall and dense, loomed over me. The silence was unsettling. Even my own footsteps on the damp ground sounded too loud. I grabbed a few logs and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. That first night, I lit a fire and sat on the couch, staring into the flames. The warmth spread through the room, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I glanced at the window, expecting to see something staring back at me. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, rattling the old window panes. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, just the isolation playing tricks on me. Sleep didn't come easy. The bed was hard, the blankets musty. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. The wind outside, the creaks of the cabin settling. Then something else. A sound just outside. A crunch like footsteps on the gravel. My body tensed. I held my breath, straining to hear. Another crunch, then silence. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe a deer. I forced myself to relax, eventually drifting into uneasy sleep. Morning came with a dull, gray light filtering through the windows. The fire had burned out, leaving only cold ashes. I got up, stretched, and went outside. The ground was damp, the air thick with the scent of wet leaves. That's when I noticed them. Footprints, leading from the tree-line to the porch. My stomach twisted. They were human and they weren't mine. They stopped right at the door, then turned back the way they had come. I scanned the trees, my pulse hammering. Nothing moved. No signs of anyone. The tracks looked fresh, pressed deep into the damp ground. I had no explanation. I hadn't heard a car, hadn't seen any signs of another person. The nearest town was miles away. Who had been out here in the middle of the night? I tried to push the thought away, but the unease stayed with me as I went about my morning. I boiled water for coffee, ate a quick breakfast, but my appetite was gone. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting someone to step out. That day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I chopped firewood, checked the generator that powered the few lights in the cabin, but my mind kept drifting back to the footprints. By the time the sun started setting, I was on edge. I double-checked the locks, made sure the windows were shut tight. As darkness fell, I sat by the fire again, listening. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My chest tightened. I grabbed the fire poker, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I sat frozen, every muscle in my body tense. Then, a sound against the door. A soft, dragging sound, like fingers trailing along the wood. My breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't move. I didn't dare. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, I forced myself to peek out the window. The porch was empty. The forest beyond was a wall of darkness. I barely slept that night. Every noise made me jolt awake. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, tossing them into the truck. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. My stomach sank. I popped the hood, but I had no clue what was wrong. The truck had been fine the day before. I weighed my options. The nearest town was too far to walk before nightfall. There was a road, but I hadn't seen another car since I arrived. I decided to wait one more night and leave at first light. I locked myself inside, not lighting the fire, not making a sound. Just after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, moving around the cabin, slow and deliberate. Then, a faint tapping on the window. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. The tapping continued, rhythmic, persistent. Then it stopped. Silence stretched on. I didn't sleep at all. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I grabbed my bag and stepped outside. The footprints were there again, circling the cabin. My hands trembled as I started walking, following the road, moving as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. It took hours, but eventually, I reached a small gas station. I used their phone to call for a tow. The mechanic who arrived looked at my truck, then at me. He said there was nothing wrong with the engine. It started on the first try. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain. I just got in and drove, putting as much distance between me and that cabin as I could. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I was not alone in those woods. I don't know why I agreed to spend the weekend alone in that cabin. Maybe it was the way my friend Mike had talked it up, saying it was the perfect place to get away from everything. No service, no people, just the quiet of the woods. Maybe it was because I just needed a break from the city, from work, from life in general. Whatever the reason, I had packed up my truck on Friday afternoon and made the drive out into the mountains, following the long, winding dirt road until I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was smaller than I had imagined, a one-room structure with a lofted bed above a tiny kitchenette. The wood was old, the kind that had darkened with time and weather. There was a front porch with a single wooden chair and a fire pit a few yards away, surrounded by stumps for sitting. The forest pressed in from all sides, thick and unyielding, the trees tall and close together. It was quiet, except for the occasional sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt isolated in a way that was both peaceful and unsettling. I unlocked the door with the key Mike had given me and stepped inside. It smelled of aged wood and dust, with the faintest hint of smoke from past fires. There was a small stove, a sink with a hand pump, and a narrow cot against the far wall. A single window looked out into the woods, and a ladder led up to the loft where the main bed was. There was no electricity, just a few oil lamps and a pile of firewood stacked against the wall. After unloading my things, I decided to take a walk before it got dark. The woods were dense but not impossible to navigate, and I found a narrow trail leading away from the cabin. The air was cool, and the deeper I went, the quieter it became. I walked for about half an hour before turning back, noting how easy it would be to lose my way if I weren't careful. By the time I returned, the sun was low, and I decided to start a fire. The flames crackled, sending sparks into the air as I sat on one of the stumps and watched the night settle in. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional chirp of a cricket or the rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, telling myself it was just my imagination. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I ate a simple meal, then went inside, locking the door behind me. The oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls as I climbed the ladder to the loft. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and despite my unease, I eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a noise outside. It was faint but distinct, the sound of footsteps on dried leaves. My heart pounded as I listened, barely breathing. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, moving past the cabin. I told myself it was an animal, but the steps were too heavy, too measured. I reached for my phone before remembering there was no service. My truck was parked out front, but I wasn't about to go outside. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sounds to return. But after a long while, there was only silence. The next morning, I found nothing unusual around the cabin. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. Still, the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. I decided to stay close to the cabin for the day, chopping wood and keeping the fire going. The hours passed slowly, and by the time the sun started to set, I felt exhausted but uneasy. That night, the sounds came again. This time, they were closer. A slow shuffling near the porch, then what sounded like something brushing against the wall. I stayed in the loft, barely daring to breathe. The noises continued for what felt like hours before fading into the distance. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. The dirt near the porch had been disturbed, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. There were no clear footprints, but the grass was pressed down in strange patterns. I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe the isolation was just getting to me. The third night was worse. I was woken by the sound of something tapping against the window. The window was small, barely large enough for a person to fit through, but the thought of someone standing there in the dark made my blood run cold. I stayed frozen, waiting. The tapping stopped, and then, for the first time, I heard breathing. Deep, slow, right outside the glass. I gripped the knife I had brought with me, my hands shaking. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Eventually, the breathing faded. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things, threw them into the truck, and started the engine. The road back felt longer than before, the trees pressing in on all sides. Every now and then, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. I never told Mike what happened. I just handed him back the key and made an excuse about being too busy to go back. He shrugged it off, probably assuming I just wasn't cut out for the solitude. I didn't correct him, but sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about that cabin, about the sounds in the dark, and I wonder if whoever or whatever was out there that weekend is still waiting for someone else to come along. I wanted to get away from everything. The city, the stress, the endless noise. I needed space to breathe, to clear my head. So I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town. The pictures showed a small wooden structure, surrounded by thick trees, no neighbors for miles. It was exactly what I was looking for. The drive took most of the day. The last stretch was a dirt road, winding through dense forest, barely wide enough for my car. No signs, no streetlights, just trees pressing in from both sides. My GPS lost signal long before I reached the cabin, but I had printed out directions just in case. When I finally arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked old but sturdy, the wood dark from years of exposure to the elements. The small porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the door. The key was in a lockbox, just as the owner had said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was simple but comfortable. A single main room with a bed in the corner, a couch, a wood stove, and a small kitchen area. The bathroom was a separate little room off to the side. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a stack of old books and a radio that barely picked up any stations. That was fine. I wasn't here for entertainment. I dropped my bag, took a deep breath, and let the silence settle around me. It was strange at first. No hum of traffic, no voices, just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. That first night, I built a fire in the stove, made a simple meal, and sat on the porch with a book. The air was crisp, the sky full of stars. Felt good to be away from everything. I don't know what woke me in the middle of the night. A sound, maybe, or just the unnatural silence. I lay there, listening, but all I could hear was the wind outside. The fire had burned low, and the room was cold. I got up to throw another log in. As I stood by the stove, I glanced at the window and froze. Something had moved outside. It was just a shadow, a flicker of movement against the trees. I stared, waiting for it to happen again, but there was nothing. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next day, I explored the area. A small path led away from the cabin, winding deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while, enjoying the quiet. The trees were thick, the ground covered in fallen leaves. I didn't see any signs of other people, no old campsites or trails, just untouched wilderness. Felt remote, isolated. That evening, as the sun was setting, I heard something, a soft rustling in the trees, then a snap like a branch breaking underfoot. I turned quickly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. That night, I locked the door. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me tense up. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. But when I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, there was nothing but darkness. The third day, I decided to check the area around the cabin more closely. I found something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. They weren't mine. I had only worn hiking boots, and these were different. Barefoot. Human. The prints were fresh, leading from the tree line to the cabin, circling around it, then back into the woods. I felt a cold knot of fear settle in my stomach. Someone had been here last night, watching. I packed my things. The plan had been to stay a week, but I wasn't about to spend another night here. The problem was my car wouldn't start. It had been fine when I arrived, but now the engine wouldn't turn over. No signal on my phone, no way to call for help. I was stuck. I spent the rest of the day inside trying to stay calm. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just some local wandering through. But why circle the cabin like that? Why come so close? As night fell, I locked the door and made sure the stove was burning hot. I sat up for hours listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Close. Slow. I held my breath, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Then the handle moved. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a fire poker, and stood by the door. The handle jiggled again, harder this time. Then silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I sat down, still gripping the poker. The fire burned low. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the sun was coming up. I opened the door slowly, heart hammering. The footprints were there again, leading away into the woods. This time, there was something else. A knife, stuck into the porch railing. A long, rusted blade, the handle wrapped in old cloth. That was it. I wasn't waiting around to find out who left it. I gathered my things, forced myself to stay calm, and tried the car again. This time, it started. I didn't look back as I drove away. Didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back in civilization. I never found out who it was. The owner of the cabin said no one lived nearby, just empty woods for miles. Maybe it was some drifter, some local hermit. Or maybe it was someone who had been watching for a long time, waiting for someone like me to come along. All I know is I won't be going back. I needed a break from everything. The city was starting to wear me down. The noise, the rush, the constant pressure of work. I just wanted to be alone for a while, somewhere quiet, away from all the distractions. That's why I rented a cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small wooden structure with a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. It was exactly what I needed. I packed light, just the basics, some clothes, canned food, a few bottles of water, a flashlight, and a hunting knife. I wasn't planning on going too far into the woods, but I wanted to be prepared. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from the city, followed by another hour on a rough dirt road. It was completely isolated. No neighbors, no cell phone service. That was the whole point. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The air was cool, the trees around the cabin tall and thick. The place looked even more remote than I had imagined. The wood of the cabin was aged and dark, the windows slightly dirty. There was a small porch with a rocking chair and a pile of firewood stacked against the side. The key was under a loose rock by the front door, just like the owner had said. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The furniture was basic: a small couch, a wooden table, a single bed with a thin mattress. The kitchen had an old stove and a small fridge that ran on a generator. There was no TV, no internet, just a few shelves with some books and a lantern on the table. The silence was thick, the kind that makes you hear your own breathing. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the small fireplace, made a simple meal, and read for a while before going to bed. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Felt peaceful. I slept well, better than I had in months. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I walked through the woods, following a small trail that led away from the cabin. The forest was dense, the trees towering over me. I found a stream about a mile away, the water clear and cold. I sat there for a while just listening. No cars, no voices, nothing but the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was perfect. But on the way back, I noticed something odd. A tree, not too far from the cabin, had deep scratches in its bark. Not the kind left by an animal. These were long, straight, and deliberate, like someone had taken a knife to it. I ran my fingers over the marks. They were fresh. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone had been out here before me. Maybe it was nothing. I forced myself to ignore it and walked back to the cabin. That night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing sounds outside, small snaps, like twigs breaking underfoot. Could have been an animal, but it felt off. The noises would start and stop, always just far enough away that I couldn't see anything when I looked outside. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I found footprints, not mine. They were faint, but they were there, leading from the edge of the woods to the porch and then back again. Someone had been here, watching. I told myself it was just a hiker, someone passing through, but I couldn't shake the unease settling in my gut. I kept the knife close that day, staying near the cabin instead of wandering. I built a fire early, as if the light would somehow keep whatever was out there away. That night, I barely slept. Every small sound made me sit up, gripping the knife in the darkness. Around midnight, I heard something heavier than before. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin once, then again. I held my breath, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. More footprints, clearer this time. Someone had been standing by the bedroom window, watching. I had planned to stay a week. I packed my bag that morning. As much as I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, I knew it wasn't. I locked the cabin behind me, threw my bag into the car, and started driving. A few miles down the road, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the tree line, watching my car disappear. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I never went back. I had been hiking alone for the past 4 days, deep in the wilderness, far from any marked trails. I liked being alone out here. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't get anywhere else. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees, birds calling from somewhere up high, and the occasional rustling of some small animal in the underbrush. I had packed enough supplies for a week, carrying everything on my back as I made my way through the thick forest. The first few days had been uneventful. I found good spots to camp each night, cooked simple meals over my small stove, and rested well. But on the fourth day, the weather changed. The sky had been cloudy all day, and by late afternoon, it started to drizzle. I wasn't too worried. My gear was waterproof and I had been in worse conditions before. But as the light faded, the drizzle turned into a steady rain, and I realized I needed to find shelter soon. Setting up camp in the rain was never fun, and I didn't want to wake up in a soaked sleeping bag. That's when I saw it. A cabin, barely visible through the trees, maybe half a mile away. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I had studied the maps before coming out here, and there hadn't been any mention of structures in this area. But there it was, a small, dark cabin with a slanted roof, standing alone in the woods. I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who went looking for trouble, and finding an abandoned building in the middle of nowhere was the kind of thing that could either be a lucky break or a very bad idea. But the rain was coming down harder now, and the idea of spending the night in a dry cabin instead of a wet tent was too tempting to pass up. I approached carefully, stepping over fallen branches and slick patches of mud. The cabin looked old but sturdy. The wood was dark with age, and the windows were covered in grime. The front door was slightly open, swaying just a little in the wind. I pushed it open wider, half expecting some animal to dart out, but nothing moved inside. I stepped in, shaking the water off my jacket. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of damp wood and something else I couldn't quite place. It was a single-room cabin, empty except for an old wooden table, a chair, and a small cot pushed up against the far wall. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, as if the wind had been blowing through the open door for years. I set my pack down and pulled out my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. There were no signs that anyone had been here recently. No footprints in the dust, no fresh wood in the small fireplace. Whoever had built this place had left it behind a long time ago. I decided to stay the night. The rain outside had turned into a downpour, and there was no way I was setting up camp in that mess. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, feeling the frame creak under my weight. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than the cold ground. I ate a quick meal from my pack, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. I wasn't afraid, but something about the place made me uneasy. Maybe it was just the way the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, or the way the trees outside seemed to lean closer in the darkness. I tried to sleep, but it was difficult. Every little noise made me open my eyes. A branch snapping outside, the wind shifting, the creak of the wooden walls settling. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then I heard something different, a sound that didn't belong. It was soft at first, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging against wood. I held my breath, listening. It stopped for a moment, then started again, this time coming from near the door. I sat up slowly, reaching for my flashlight. I shone the beam toward the door, half expecting to see an animal trying to get in. But there was nothing, just the old wooden door, slightly ajar, moving with the wind. I got up and walked over, pushing it shut. The latch didn't hold well, so I dragged the chair over and wedged it under the handle. That should keep it from blowing open again. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about that sound, the dragging noise. I tried to convince myself it had been the wind, but something about it didn't feel right. An hour passed, maybe more. I was lying there, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again, louder this time. A scraping, dragging sound, not from the door, from inside the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding. My flashlight was still in my hand. I flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the room. The chair was still against the door. The table and cot hadn't moved. Then I saw it, the floor, near the far wall, where the dirt and leaves had been scattered. Something had been moved. The dust had been disturbed, as if something had been dragged across it. I stood up slowly, moving toward it. My boots made no sound on the wooden floor. I knelt down, shining my light closer. A trapdoor. It had been hidden beneath the dirt and debris. The edges were barely visible, but now that I was looking for it, I could see it clearly. And it had been moved recently. My stomach tightened. Someone had opened this, and whatever was down there wasn't alone. The idea of spending a few days alone in a cabin deep in the woods seemed perfect when I first planned it. Life had become too noisy, too crowded, and I needed a break from everything. A friend had recommended the place, an old but well-kept cabin about an hour away from the nearest town, completely off-grid. It was owned by an older couple who rented it out occasionally. No cell service, no internet, just trees and silence. Exactly what I was looking for. The drive there was peaceful at first. The road wound through dense forest, sunlight filtering through the trees, casting moving shadows across the dirt path. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. I hadn't seen another car for miles. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked my car near the porch and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The cabin was simple, just a small wooden structure with a covered porch and a single window facing the clearing. The trees pressed in close around it, making it feel almost hidden. I unlocked the door with the key the owners had left for me under a rock near the entrance and stepped inside. The air smelled of wood and dust, the way old cabins always do. Inside, everything was basic but comfortable. There was a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a fireplace in the main living area. A few shelves lined the walls, holding old books, a lantern, and other small items left by previous guests. A handwritten note from the owners sat on the wooden table, welcoming me and reminding me to use the generator for power if needed. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking and getting used to the place. I checked the small gas stove, made sure the water pump worked, and tested the old generator outside. Everything seemed fine. I had brought enough food to last me the whole trip, and there was a pile of firewood stacked against the side of the cabin. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The air was cool, and the only noise was the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. It was the kind of quiet I had been craving. When I finally went inside, I locked the door behind me, checked the windows, and went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling uneasy. The room was completely dark except for the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. Something had woken me, but I couldn't tell what. I lay still, listening. Outside, the wind had died down, and the forest was silent. Too silent. No night sounds, no insects, nothing. Just a heavy, pressing quiet. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to break the silence. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. I shook off the strange feeling from the night before and went about my day. I spent most of the morning exploring the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods, and I followed it for a while, enjoying the fresh air. The forest felt different during the day, calmer, less intimidating. I found a small stream not far from the cabin, its water clear and cold. I sat on a fallen tree, listening to the sound of the water, letting the quiet settle over me. That evening, as the sun set, I gathered some firewood and started a fire outside. I cooked a simple meal, enjoying the warmth of the flames as the air grew colder. The feeling of unease from the previous night had almost faded. Then I heard it, a sound coming from the trees. Soft, almost careful footsteps. I turned my head sharply, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The forest was thick, the trees forming a solid wall of blackness. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I had heard something. A branch snapped, closer this time. I stood up, heart pounding. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, but something felt off. The sound of the footsteps had been deliberate, too measured. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shined it into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees. I stayed by the fire for a long time, listening, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it and went inside, locking the door behind me. I kept the fire going in the fireplace and sat by the window for a while, staring out into the darkness. Hours passed. Just as I was beginning to feel tired, I heard it again. The footsteps, but this time they were closer, just outside the cabin. I froze. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate steps moving around the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for the flashlight again, but hesitated. Whoever or whatever was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. The steps stopped near the porch. I strained to hear anything else, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, softly, the doorknob rattled. I gripped the flashlight tightly, barely breathing. The rattling stopped after a few seconds, and the footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I sat there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn appeared through the window. When I finally stepped outside, I checked the ground around the cabin. The dirt was damp from the night air, and there, leading from the edge of the forest to my door, were footprints. Bare, human. I packed my things quickly, throwing everything into my bag. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded my gear into the car, got in, and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Panic rose in my chest. I checked the battery, the fuel, everything seemed fine. But the car wouldn't start. I had no choice. I grabbed my backpack, took a deep breath, and started walking. The road was long, but I knew if I followed it, I'd eventually reach town. I kept looking over my shoulder, my nerves on edge with every sound from the forest. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a truck approaching from the distance. I waved it down, relief flooding through me as the driver pulled over. When I got back to town, I called the owners to let them know I was leaving early. I didn't mention what had happened. I just told them my car had broken down and I had decided to leave on foot. A week later, the owner called me back. He had gone to check on the cabin and found my car still there, untouched. The strange part, he said, was that when he tried the ignition, the car started on the first try. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. The roads were winding, cutting through dense forests, and the occasional pothole made the journey rougher than I had planned. The rental car wasn't in the best shape either, but it was enough to get me there. I had been wanting a break from everything, the noise of the city, the constant notifications on my phone, and the never-ending responsibilities. A few days alone in the mountains seemed like the perfect way to reset. When I finally arrived, the sun was beginning to set. The cabin was exactly as described: small, rustic, and isolated. It was built from thick logs, and the roof looked recently repaired. There was a small porch with a single wooden chair, and a stack of firewood leaned against the side of the cabin. The area around it was mostly trees, towering pines, and a few bare, skeletal branches that creaked softly in the wind. I hadn't seen another person for the last hour of my drive, which only confirmed how truly alone I was out here. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen area, a couch, and a fireplace in the corner. A single bed with heavy blankets was pushed against the wall. There was a small bathroom, just enough for what I needed. It smelled of old wood and something faintly damp, but that was to be expected. The first thing I did was check my phone, no service. That was part of the plan, though, so I wasn't too concerned. I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and told myself that this was exactly what I needed. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple meal, read for a while, and listened to the sounds of the forest outside. It was colder than I had expected, so I built a fire. The crackling of the flames was oddly comforting. I slept well, despite the unfamiliar surroundings. The next day, I decided to explore the area. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, and the ground was uneven, covered in fallen branches and patches of damp leaves. I walked for hours, not really following a path, just enjoying the silence. At one point, I found a small stream, its water clear and ice-cold. I sat by it for a while, listening to the steady flow, feeling the sun on my face. It was peaceful, and I told myself I had made the right choice coming here. It was only on my way back that I started to feel uneasy. The woods, which had felt welcoming before, suddenly seemed different. The trees were too still, the air too quiet. I had the sense that something was watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I quickened my pace anyway. By the time I reached the cabin, my heart was pounding. I locked the door behind me and forced myself to shake off the feeling. That night, I struggled to sleep. Every little noise outside made me sit up and listen. The wind rustled the trees, but every now and then, I swore I heard something else. A soft crunching, like footsteps. I reminded myself that animals moved through these woods all the time, but that didn't make it easier to relax. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, It was pitch dark, the fire long since burned out. I lay still, listening. There it was again, that crunching sound. Closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. Then something scraped against the side of the cabin. Not the wind, not an animal. Something deliberate. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I slowly reached for the flashlight beside my bed. My hand was shaking. I didn't want to turn it on. I didn't want to see what was outside. But I couldn't just lay there, waiting. I took a deep breath and flicked it on. The light cast long shadows against the walls. I forced myself to get up, step by step, and move toward the window. The glass was cold under my fingers as I lifted the curtain just enough to peek outside. Nothing, just trees, darkness, and the faint outline of the porch. My breath fogged up the glass as I exhaled. Maybe I had imagined it. I turned away, but just as I did, I heard it again. Closer, a low creak of the porch boards under weight. I spun back to the window, but this time I didn't lift the curtain. Couldn't. I stood there, frozen, listening. The sound stopped. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I stayed by the window, flashlight off now, waiting for something more. But nothing happened. Eventually, I forced myself back to bed, though I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I stepped outside hesitantly, half expecting to find footprints or some other sign that I hadn't imagined everything. But the ground was undisturbed. The porch was empty. If something had been there, it hadn't left any trace. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I made up my mind to leave early. Maybe I was overreacting, but I didn't care. I packed up quickly, loaded the car, and took one last look at the cabin before getting in. I locked the door behind me out of habit, though I knew it wouldn't matter if someone or something really wanted to get inside. The drive back felt longer. The trees seemed to press in closer, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing, just the road and the endless forest. By the time I reached the main highway, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I told myself I had let my imagination get the best of me, that I had scared myself for no reason. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something had been out there. Something had been watching. And I was just lucky I left before I found out what it was.